It is entirely possible to shoot down every single weapon your enemy fires and still lose the war by going bankrupt. For decades, the gold standard of airspace protection has been the Patriot missile system. It is a heavy, highly sophisticated piece of engineering designed to track and destroy multi-million-dollar ballistic missiles. But the modern threat looks very different. Militaries are now facing massive swarms of weapons, like the Iranian-designed Shahed kamikaze drone, a crude, disposable aircraft powered by a simple piston engine. A defending army spends $3.5 million on a Patriot interceptor to destroy a Shahed drone costing just $20,000. If an attacker launches 50,000 cheap drones, that 1-to-190 ratio compounds rapidly, mathematically draining the defender's military budget. Under these conditions, holding the technological high ground turns into an economic liability. The defender runs out of money long before the attacker runs out of drones. Armies recognized this math problem and quickly pivoted to cheaper countermeasures. They deployed electronic warfare, specifically radio frequency jammers, designed to sever the wireless connection between the incoming drones and their remote operators. The attackers adapted almost immediately. They programmed the drones to fly autonomous routes using internal navigation, or they physically tethered the aircraft to their launch sites with miles of unspooled fiber optic cable, rendering them immune to wireless jamming. Desperate for any kind of shield, troops on the front lines began welding heavy metal grids, often called cope cages, onto $4 million tanks and stringing ordinary nylon fishing nets across vital supply roads. But physical barriers proved highly inconsistent. A skilled pilot could manually maneuver their drone through a gap in the netting, or a single cluster munition could shred the entire defense in seconds. Neither the high-end sensors nor these improvised barriers closed the gap. Even with a range of existing tools, the sheer volume of drone strikes meant that for much of the front line, the airspace remained a wide-open vulnerability. Closing that gap required a shift in doctrine, fighting a cheap weapon with something even cheaper. Frontline soldiers took off-the-shelf commercial racing drones operated with a first-person view headset. They strapped small explosives to the chassis and began manually hunting the incoming threats high in the sky. What began as an emergency trench improvisation quickly formalized. Engineers began manufacturing purpose-built interceptor drones with names like the Sting and the P-1 Sun. Looking at this schematic, you can see how these interceptors operate. Built around 3D printed modular frames, they launch vertically, climb to an operating altitude of 10,000 feet, and chase down their targets at speeds over 210 miles per hour. The pilot spots the incoming Shahed through their goggles and physically rams the small interceptor drone directly into it. The total cost of that localized air defense is about $2,100. For the first time, the defensive measure now costs a fraction of the weapon it destroys. Standard military hardware usually takes a decade of bureaucratic procurement to reach the battlefield. Lacking that kind of time, Ukraine routed development through a government-backed defense tech cluster called Brave One. This created a rapid feedback loop. If an interceptor failed on Tuesday, engineers received data from the trenches and pushed a code update Thursday. By distributing open-source blueprints and relying on easily sourced commercial parts, they achieved a massive manufacturing scale. Production quickly ramped up to 10,000 new interceptor units every single month. Ukraine bypassed the traditional arms industry entirely, engineering an agile billion-dollar defense startup under active fire. These interceptor teams are now hitting an 80% success rate against incoming Shaheds. That allows the military to keep their multi-million-dollar Patriot missiles in their silos, reserving them exclusively for actual ballistic threats. And other nations are taking notes. Arab states facing those exact same Iranian-designed drone swarms are now turning to Kyiv for a solution. This has established a concrete value exchange. Ukraine is now deploying hundreds of military experts to the Gulf region, providing interceptor software and pilot training in exchange for strategic resources like PAC-3 missiles. Global security now prioritizes the ability to iterate rapidly and mathematically outprice an opponent. Adaptation is the new standard of military supremacy.